In this class, we will be examining the debates about the origins of human rights. If human rights are universal claims that humans have simply by virtue of their humanity, where does the study of human rights begin? What are the normative origins of the human rights idea and rights movements generally? Although the 20th century has been described as the age of the human rights revolution, human rights remains an elusive concept because multiple and competing claims can and have been made historically in the name of human rights. Several human rights stories of origin are possible. We will examine some of these human rights stories in this class. The term human rights has been used to convey a wide range of ideas and practices, from notions of freedom, liberty, and human dignity within anti-slavery movements to claims about political liberties, self-determination, and democratic rights. Some of these human rights stories have clearly received more attention than others in the human rights history. Despite the deep history of rights movements and ideas, human rights have come to be seen as a uniquely 20th century invention, the age of the human rights revolution, ushered by the Second World War and specific events that followed that war. Conventional histories of modern human rights agree that human rights came into prominence with the end of the Second World War. The histories emphasize the universal human rights regimes introduced with the establishment of the United Nations and the new international order that this era ushered. Indeed, the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948 was a defining moment in the development of the global human rights movement. Both the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights challenged the principles of state sovereignty that emerged from the Peace of Westphalia 3 centuries earlier, which had governed the relationship between nations and empires. Human rights featured prominently in the visions of the post-war international order and in the establishment of the United Nations. This is evident in the United Nations Charter, which expresses faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small. But is this really where the history of human rights begins? More recent histories of human rights have gone beyond the 20th century meanings of human rights to examine the deeper historical antecedents of the human rights idea. Throughout history, peoples around the world have grappled with ideas about human dignity, fairness, respect, and responsibility. It is fitting, therefore, to describe human rights as an idea that is thousands and thousands of years in the making. But where precisely does the human rights story begin? Accounts of human rights origin and genealogy are dominated by questions of meaning as scholars seek to make connections between modern interpretations of human rights and the historical ideas that have shaped them. Most accounts acknowledge that the principles included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which have come to define the international human rights movement, have sources in prior rights traditions. There is a growing inclination towards re-examining, from human rights perspectives, key historical events, including, for example, anti-slavery movements, indigenous social systems and rights traditions, Enlightenment liberalism, and 18th century Euro-American political revolutions. There is also an inclination to re-examine themes in history like colonialism, imperialism, and anti-colonialism from human rights lens. Key contributions to these topics have charted new histories of the origins of human rights, showing the complex links between past human rights struggles and a human rights movement that has been cast as a uniquely 20th century phenomenon. The history of human rights is marked by certain defining events and episodes. These represent milestones in the development of the human rights idea that various scholars have identified and emphasized. Among historians, there is no agreement, however, on which of these episodes marked the most significant turning point in the development of modern human rights. At least 10 of these episodes have been identified, and a few of them stand out. Ancient religious and secular humanisms, classical philosophical traditions, Enlightenment liberalism, 18th century Euro-American political revolutions, the anti-slavery movement, the Second World War and the Holocaust, the emergence of the United Nations and the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, anti-colonial movements, and finally, the universalizing human rights agenda of the 1970s, characterized by the rise of international human rights non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. Most human rights histories begin with the assumption that rights ideas are as old as civilization. Several accounts of the global history of human rights go as far back as the Hammurabi Code and the religious traditions of Buddhist, Hindu, and Confucian texts, the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran. Although few accounts draw direct connections between these early religious traditions and the modern concept of human rights, there is agreement that ancient ideas and practices are the normative beginnings of the human rights idea. Many accounts seek the direct origins of human rights in Western legal and philosophical traditions, such as in natural law theory. Most histories of human rights begin the story here, tracing modern conceptions of rights and liberties from natural law and ancient Greek Stoicism through the medieval period to Enlightenment liberalism. Natural law philosophy, characterized by the belief that laws and rules of conduct are embedded and derivable from human nature, has become a secure place in antiquity to ground universal human rights. Since human nature is the same the world over, the laws derived from that nature are seen as universal and true to all humans at all times and places. Thus, they are unquestionably inherent, objective, and absolute. Some accounts make more explicit connections between the notion of natural law and rights ideas that emerged from socio-political tumult of Enlightenment Europe. Enlightenment liberalism and notions of freedom and equality, particularly in the use and ownership of property, created unprecedented commitments to individual expression and world experience, reflected in varied writings from the works of Thomas Aquinas and Hugo Grotius to the provisions of the Magna Carta, the English Petition of Rights of 1628, and the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Enlightenment liberalism and Enlightenment thought, founded on natural law, inaugurated a new intellectual tradition in which the individual as a political actor was abstracted from the holistic totality of medieval society. Other accounts emphasize the Euro-American political revolutions of the 18th century. These revolutions and the documents they inspired are said to be the central points to modern human rights because they espouse the notion of the autonomous individual endowed with certain inalienable rights. The American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen asserted new regimes of rights in principle, even if these rights were not really extended to everyone in practice. The American Declaration of Independence famously proclaims that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the origins of human rights are not limited to histories of Western liberalism or the Euro-American revolutions. The underlying ideas of freedom, dignity, equality, and egalitarianism that we now associate with universal human rights also have foundations in many traditions across the world, in various regions and cultures. Before the emergence of the modern nation-state in the 19th century, moral and legal principles for protecting human rights existed in other forms in different societies around the world. For example, proponents of Asian values and African values in the interpretation of human rights point to traditional communitarian principles in these societies that have historically served as a foundation for protecting liberties and fundamental freedoms. These values are also part of the foundation of modern human rights. In order to get a full understanding of the historical origins of human rights ideas, as they've developed in various societies around the world, we must look at the histories of these different societies, their secular and religious traditions, their social value systems, and their political principles. The notion of universal human rights suggests that human rights are core values that we all share as humans. If these values are universal, it makes sense, therefore, to seek the origins of human rights in our collective histories. To do so, we must explore the social and cultural foundations of different societies around the world that have influenced the idea of human rights as we understand them today.